The cold of space had always felt like a constant, an unfeeling void that mirrored the isolation Seraphina Aldrich often felt in the deepest crevices of her mind. As the commander of Earth's last fleet, she had grown accustomed to the silence of the vast expanse, the hum of her ship's engines, and the constant pressure that never left her chest. But today, as she stood at the command console aboard the Resolute, the silence held a different weight, a heavy, ominous tone. "Commander Aldrich," came the voice of her second-in-command, Captain Niles, his voice crackling through the comms. "We have a problem." Seraphina turned to him, her eyes narrowing as she studied the map of their last known human stronghold, the orbital station. New Dawn. The station had once been a beacon of hope, a symbol of humanity's resilience. Now, it was a vulnerable outpost floating in the depths of enemy territory. "Define problem, Captain," Seraphina replied, her voice calm but tinged with the sharpness of someone who had seen too many problems and not enough solutions. Niles hesitated. He hated delivering bad news. "The Gorrath fleet has made a move. They're headed straight for us. And we can't outrun them." Seraphina's fingers tightened around the railing at the edge of the command center. The Gorrath were the worst kind of enemy, ruthless, relentless, and always one step ahead. And now, they were coming for the last stronghold of humanity. "How much time?" Seraphina asked, the weight of the situation sinking in. "Less than 12 hours, Niles said, his face tight with concern. "We've already lost contact with New Dawn's main communications relay. I don't think they're aware of the danger yet." Seraphina's mind was already racing. 12 hours. The Gorrath's surprise attack methods were devastating. Their biological warfare had crippled entire planets in mere days. If New Dawn wasn't prepared, it would fall within hours, and with it, the last hope of rallying Earth's scattered forces. "Alert the fleet," she ordered, her voice sharp, unwavering. "Prepare for battle, but keep the communications open. I want a direct link with New Dawn. We're going to warn them before it's too late." She turned away from Niles, her gaze fixed on the starry expanse outside. A new wave of dread washed over her, but she shoved it down. She couldn't afford weakness now, not when so many depended on her. Minutes later, the fleet was in motion, its ships lined up in a defensive formation, an imposing presence against the backdrop of the void. Seraphina stood at the head of her war room, her eyes scanning the tactical map, analyzing every possible outcome. "Commander, we have a priority message from New Dawn." A voice from the communications panel broke through the tense silence. Seraphina's heart skipped a beat. "Patch it through." The screen flickered to life, revealing Commander Layla Winters, the human in charge of New Dawn. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with alarm. "Seraphina," Layla said, her voice strained. "We've detected an incoming Gorrath fleet. We need reinforcements, now." Seraphina's grip on the console tightened. "We're en route," she replied, doing her best to keep her tone steady. "Hold your position. We'll be there in less than 6 hours." The transmission ended, leaving Seraphina with a single thought: would they make it in time? Hours later, the Resolute and the rest of the fleet emerged from the folds of space near the fringes of New Dawn's system. The stars outside seemed to shimmer with a distant promise of hope, if only they could reach it in time. "Sir, Gorrath ships incoming," one of the officers reported, their voice cold, calculated. "They're not even bothering to cloak themselves." Seraphina looked up, her gaze hard. The Gorrath were arrogant. They knew they had the upper hand. And they wanted to make a statement. "Prepare to engage." "Shields up," Seraphina commanded, her voice steady, but her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. She knew what was at stake. If they failed here, humanity would be done for. The battle erupted in a flash of light and sound. The Gorrath ships, massive, insect-like behemoths, emerged from the darkness, their guns lighting up the void. The Resolute and the rest of the fleet retaliated with everything they had, their weapons scorching the blackness of space. Seraphina's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the first wave of Gorrath ships close in. The Resolute's cannons fired in quick succession, blasting one of the enemy's ships into pieces, but the victory was fleeting. More ships emerged from the darkness, overwhelming in their numbers. "This is too much," Niles shouted from his station. "We can't hold them off forever. They're swarming us." Seraphina's eyes flicked over the battlefield, her mind working in overdrive. They couldn't win this fight with brute force alone. They needed strategy. They needed an edge. "Set a course for their flagship," Seraphina ordered, the plan forming in her mind. "We're going to take down their command center." "You're insane, Commander," Niles said, disbelief in his voice. "That's suicide." Seraphina's eyes met his, her expression hard. "Do you have a better idea, Captain?" The Resolute plunged into the heart of the Gorrath fleet, taking fire from all sides. The ship groaned under the barrage, but it held firm. Seraphina's hands flew over the controls, guiding the vessel with surgical precision through the enemy's fire. Every moment felt like an eternity, the sound of explosions reverberating through the hull, each one a reminder of what was at stake. As they neared the Gorrath flagship, Seraphina could see the massive vessel ahead, a looming, fortress-like structure, glowing with the eerie red light of its weapons systems charging. "Brace for impact," she ordered, her voice calm despite the chaos around them. The Resolute broke through the last line of enemy ships, its shields cracking under the strain. The Gorrath flagship loomed larger, its guns locking onto their position. But Seraphina didn't hesitate. She knew they had only one chance. With a final, determined breath, she steered the ship straight for the flagship's main reactor. "Now or never," Seraphina whispered to herself. And then, with a blinding flash of light, everything went dark. The cold of space was no longer just a void, it was a suffocating pressure, a reminder of the reality Seraphina Aldrich now faced. The Resolute's lights flickered back to life, but the sense of victory that had flared in her chest after their assault on the Gorrath flagship had quickly dimmed. The battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. "Report," she demanded, her voice steady despite the tremor of exhaustion in her limbs. She knew the odds were stacked against them, but her mind was already calculating the next move. "We've lost 2 ships, Commander. Our fleet is barely holding together." Niles's voice crackled over the comms. His words were clipped, but the gravity of his tone told Seraphina everything she needed to know. The Resolute had sustained heavy damage, but it was still operational, barely. The Gorrath flagship had been crippled, but the Gorrath were not a race to go down quietly. Their backup forces had been quick to regroup, rallying faster than Seraphina had anticipated. "We can't afford to keep fighting in open space," Niles continued. "We need to retreat and regroup." "No," Seraphina replied instantly, her gaze fixed on the tactical screen. The Gorrath fleet was closing in again, the warships massive shadows against the light of distant stars. She wasn't ready to concede, not yet. Not after everything Earth had lost. "We're not retreating. We're going to hit them where it hurts." Seraphina's hand hovered over the map, her finger tracing a line toward a remote asteroid field in the outer rim of the system. "Set course for these coordinates," she ordered, her voice calm, but with a quiet ferocity that burned in her gut. "We'll make a stand there. We need the element of surprise." The crew scrambled to follow her command, and within moments, the Resolute altered its course. The ship shuddered under the strain of its failing engines, but Seraphina didn't let the fatigue show on her face. The Gorrath would be forced into their trap. They didn't know it yet, but the tide was about to turn. Hours later, Seraphina stood on the bridge, her eyes scanning the field of asteroids ahead. It was a perilous location, with debris fields and shattered rock formations scattered throughout. Perfect for a sneak attack. Perfect for a tactical advantage. The Gorrath ships would have to maneuver carefully to track them in such an environment. "They're coming," Niles reported, his eyes flicking between the viewscreen and his console. 3 warships closing fast. "Good," Seraphina muttered. "Let them think we're running." She watched as the Gorrath fleet advanced, their sensors no doubt searching for the Resolute in the vastness of the asteroid field. Seraphina's lips curled into a slight smile. The enemy had fallen into her trap. Activate the cloaking device, she ordered. The ship's shields flickered as the Resolute's cloaking field powered up, turning the vessel into little more than a faint shadow against the asteroid belt. The Gorrath wouldn't know what hit them. Moments later, the enemy ships entered the asteroid field, their massive forms moving slowly, cautiously, trying to pick up any sign of the Resolute. But Seraphina was already 2 steps ahead. "Open fire!" she commanded, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. A series of explosions erupted as the Resolute unleashed a barrage of weapons at the Gorrath fleet. Laser beams sliced through space, striking the lead warship dead center. The Gorrath ships immediately retaliated, their weapons lighting up the void with fiery intensity. But Seraphina wasn't concerned about the damage. She had calculated this. The Resolute was faster, more agile than the Gorrath ships, and with the asteroid field surrounding them, the Gorrath were forced to fight in a confined space, their movements limited. As her crew continued to fire, Seraphina's mind raced. She had to get close enough to disable the enemy's weapons systems, without getting caught in the crossfire. The next few moments would determine everything. "Engage evasive maneuvers," she ordered, her voice firm. The Resolute darted through the asteroid field, dodging incoming fire as the Gorrath ships struggled to keep up. It was a deadly dance, maneuvering through floating rocks, dodging laser blasts, and firing whenever they had an opening. "Shields at 70%, Niles warned, his voice strained. "We're running out of time." "We'll make it," Seraphina said, her focus unwavering. "Just stay with me." The next few moments felt like an eternity. The Resolute was skimming the edges of a massive asteroid, using the rock's bulk as cover while their weapons recharged. The Gorrath were persistent, but they were getting sloppy. They underestimated the human crew's ingenuity, and Seraphina would make sure they paid for it. "Now!" she shouted, and in one swift move, the Resolute darted out from behind the asteroid and unleashed a concentrated blast at the nearest Gorrath warship's weapons array. The impact was devastating. The Gorrath ship's shields flared and sputtered before collapsing entirely. Seraphina watched as the warship listed, its systems failing. It was going down, fast. "We've taken out their main weapons," Niles reported, his voice triumphant but still tense. "1 down. 2 to go." Seraphina allowed herself a brief breath. "Prepare for the second wave." But just as they were about to regroup, a harsh signal broke through their communications system. It wasn't a Gorrath transmission. This was something different, alien, distorted. "Commander Aldrich," a voice crackled, deep and rasping, coming from an unfamiliar source. "You think you've won? This is only the beginning." Seraphina's stomach clenched. She'd heard of rogue factions, mercenary groups with ties to the Gorrath, but this voice, it wasn't one she recognized. "Who are you?" she demanded, stepping forward. "What do you want?" The voice hissed through the static. "You've just opened the door, Commander. And now, it's too late." Before she could respond, the transmission cut off abruptly. Seraphina's thoughts raced, her mind grappling with the new information. This was more than just a fight for survival. There was something darker at play here. Someone was pulling the strings, and they were far more dangerous than the Gorrath. "Alert the fleet," she ordered, her voice cold with realization. "Prepare for a new threat." As she stared out at the asteroid field, a chill ran down her spine. The real war, it seemed, was just beginning. The sound of alarms filled the Resolute, a constant reminder of the chaos unfolding around them. Seraphina Aldrich's knuckles were white as she gripped the console, her eyes fixed on the tactical map, watching as the remnants of the Gorrath fleet regrouped. The initial success of their attack had been a fleeting victory, but the real battle had just begun. "We've got incoming," Niles said, his voice tight with urgency. 2 more warships. The Gorrath aren't backing down." Seraphina's gaze didn't waver from the screen. The fleet was in disarray, scattered across the asteroid field, trying to regroup. But the Gorrath weren't just retaliating, they were hunting. And they were relentless. "We can't keep this up," Niles continued, his frustration evident. We've lost too many ships, and we're running low on resources. Seraphina's mind was already working through the possibilities, calculating the risks and rewards. Retreat wasn't an option. There was no place left to run. If they didn't strike now, they'd lose everything. Earth, humanity's last hope, would be extinguished. Prepare for a final strike, Seraphina commanded, her voice sharp. Her team had given everything they had, but now they had one last chance. She wasn't going to let the Gorrath take them down. Not without a fight. We're going after their flagship, she said, her eyes locking with Niles. Full speed ahead. The Resolute darted through the asteroid field once more, weaving between massive rocks, evading the enemy's tracking systems. Seraphina was focused, her hands moving with precision over the ship's controls. Every maneuver, every decision, was life or death. Her crew trusted her, and she couldn't let them down now. Shields are holding at 50%, Niles reported, his voice tinged with relief. But we're not going to last much longer if we don't end this soon. We will, Seraphina said firmly, her eyes scanning the expanse ahead. The Gorrath flagship was within reach now, a massive, monolithic structure looming in the distance. It was heavily armed, with an arsenal capable of wiping out entire fleets, but the Resolute had one advantage the Gorrath didn't: surprise. We've got one shot at this, Seraphina muttered to herself, more to calm her own racing mind than anyone else. She adjusted their trajectory, the Resolute's engines roaring as it shot forward, closing the gap between them and the enemy flagship. The Gorrath didn't see them coming until it was too late. Fire! Seraphina ordered. The Resolute unleashed everything it had: lasers, missiles, railguns, all aimed directly at the flagship's weak points. The first barrage hit with devastating force, but the flagship's shields held, flickering under the intensity of the attack. They're returning fire! Niles shouted, his voice tense. The Gorrath's weapon systems lit up, targeting the Resolute with a barrage of energy blasts. The ship shook violently as the first few hits made contact. Shields down to 30%, Niles continued. We can't take another hit like that. Seraphina's mind raced, her fingers moving rapidly over the console. They couldn't afford to take another direct hit. She needed to disable the flagship's weapons, fast. Adjust course! Move to the left flank, she commanded. The Resolute veered sharply, narrowly avoiding a direct hit that would have been catastrophic. They had to keep moving, keep the Gorrath guessing. Another hit! Shields at 20%, Niles shouted. Seraphina gritted her teeth. We don't stop until that ship goes down. With a final burst of speed, Seraphina guided the Resolute straight toward the flagship's underbelly, where the shield generators were located. It was a risky move, but it was their best chance. The ship was taking fire from every direction, but Seraphina didn't hesitate. Fire the disruptor cannon, she ordered, her voice cutting through the chaos. The Resolute's most powerful weapon powered up, a crackling ball of energy surging toward the flagship's weak point. The impact was deafening. The flagship's shields flared brightly before collapsing entirely. The Resolute's cannon had struck true. Direct hit! Niles exclaimed. Their shields are down. We've got a chance! Seraphina didn't waste a second. All remaining firepower, now! The Resolute fired relentlessly, hitting the flagship with everything left in their arsenal. The enemy's defenses were crumbling, the flagship's once imposing structure now breaking apart under the weight of the assault. But the Gorrath weren't done yet. They still had weapons in reserve, and they would fight until the last ship fell. Get the boarding teams ready, Seraphina ordered. We're taking that ship. The Resolute closed the distance, locking onto the flagship with their docking systems. A tense silence followed as the crew prepared for the final assault. Boarding teams are ready, Niles reported. On your command? Let's finish this, Seraphina said, her voice low and steady. Boarding teams, deploy! The airlock opened, and the crew poured onto the flagship's hull, weapons drawn, ready for whatever lay ahead. Seraphina led the charge, her heart pounding in her chest, her every step calculated. The Gorrath were ruthless, but they were no match for the human will to survive. They moved through the corridors of the flagship with precision, cutting down Gorrath soldiers as they encountered them. The ship was a labyrinth of alien technology, but Seraphina's team was well trained, prepared for any environment. They pushed forward, determined to reach the control room. As they reached the central command deck, Seraphina's pulse quickened. This was it. The Gorrath flagship was falling apart around them, but the final blow would come when they took control of the ship's command center. "Ready," Seraphina whispered, her voice unwavering. She kicked open the doors to the command room, and the crew stormed in, weapons aimed. The Gorrath commander stood at the helm, flanked by a group of his soldiers. He was a towering figure, his eyes burning with rage. But even in the face of defeat, he didn't falter. "You think you've won, human?" the Gorrath commander sneered. "This is just the beginning." Seraphina's eyes locked onto him. "You've lost." With a swift motion, she gave the order, and her team took the Gorrath commander into custody. The ship was theirs. The Gorrath had been defeated, for now. But Seraphina knew this was only one battle in a much larger war. As the flagship's systems began to power down, she allowed herself a brief moment of victory. The human race had won this round. But she knew the fight for survival was far from over. The Resolute had struck the final blow. But somewhere out there, more enemies waited. And she would be ready for them. The silence was the loudest thing Seraphina Aldrich had ever heard. As the Resolute drifted away from the smoldering remains of the Gorrath flagship, the enormity of their victory settled in, but it felt hollow. The battlefield around them was still shrouded in a storm of debris and shattered ships, fragments of the Gorrath Empire floating in the vacuum of space. But within the hull of the Resolute, everything was quiet. The usual hum of activity that once filled the ship's corridors had all but faded into a solemn stillness. "We did it," Niles said, his voice low as he approached Seraphina at the command console. "We've won." Seraphina didn't look at him. She couldn't. "Not yet." "We've survived," she replied softly, her fingers tracing the edge of the map that still displayed the remnants of the Gorrath forces. "But we haven't won." "Not really." The battle was over, but the war was far from finished. Their victory had come at a steep price. The Gorrath flagship was down, but there were still pockets of their forces scattered across the galaxy. Worse, Seraphina knew that the Gorrath had allies, powerful allies who were waiting for the right moment to strike. This was only the beginning. "Have we accounted for everyone?" Seraphina asked, finally turning to Niles. He hesitated. "We've lost 10 ships. Nearly half the crew." Seraphina felt the weight of those words like a physical blow. 10 ships. Her mind wandered to the faces of the crew members lost in the fight. Those she had fought alongside. Those who had given everything. The pain of their loss threatened to crack her resolve, but she shoved it away. She couldn't afford to break now. "Prepare the fleet to rendezvous at the next system," Seraphina ordered. Her voice was steady, but inside she was struggling to hold it together. "We need to regroup and assess our next steps." She felt a shift in the air as Niles nodded, but before he could leave, he hesitated. "Seraphina, you're not." "I'm fine." She cut him off, her gaze unwavering. "We have work to do." Hours later, the Resolute's crew was gathered in the war room. The lights were dimmed, and a quiet murmur spread throughout the room as Seraphina stood before them. The men and women who had survived the battle were tired, their faces etched with exhaustion and grief, but there was a flicker of hope in their eyes. They had won. For now. "The Gorrath are broken, but they're not gone," Seraphina began, her voice strong and resolute. "We've gained ground, but we've also made enemies. Powerful ones." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. "We need to be ready. The next wave is coming. And it won't be just the Gorrath. There are factions, mercenaries, warlords, who are going to rise in the vacuum we've created." A murmur of concern swept through the room. "We've fought too long, too hard, to let everything fall apart now," she continued, her eyes scanning the faces of her crew. We've lost too much. We need to rebuild. Regroup. Prepare for what's next. A silence fell over the room. Seraphina's words hung in the air like a weight. They all knew the truth. Victory wasn't the end. It was just a momentary pause before the next battle. Where do we go from here? Niles asked, breaking the silence. We go forward, Seraphina answered without hesitation. We rebuild. But we do it smarter. We make alliances. We prepare. And we wait. The room remained quiet, but Seraphina felt the shift. There was a renewed sense of purpose in the air. They had been tested, broken even, but they were still standing. The human race was still alive. Everyone, prepare for departure, Seraphina commanded. We leave within the hour. Our fight isn't over. Not yet. The Resolute and its fleet made the jump to the next system, the distant stars flickering in their wake. But even as they left the remnants of the battle behind, Seraphina knew that the real fight was just beginning. The galaxy was filled with enemies who had only been waiting for the right moment. The Gorrath had been only the first wave. Commander, Niles said as he approached her once more, his voice hesitant. You know what this means, right? Seraphina turned to face him, her eyes narrowing. She didn't need to hear the question to understand it. The real war is still out there, she said, her tone firm. We've won a battle. But the war will never end. Niles nodded, his expression grim. So what now? We fight, Seraphina replied simply. We fight until there's nothing left. We fight for humanity. We fight for Earth. There was a long pause, as both of them absorbed the weight of her words. The Resolute was small, but it was all they had left. The human race had no choice but to fight. There were no more safe havens. No more alliances they could count on. No more turning back. They would have to build something new, something stronger. Something that could stand against the darkness closing in from all sides. As Seraphina stood at the command center, looking out at the stars, she felt the burden of command press down on her. But there was no fear, no hesitation in her heart. They would rebuild. They would stand tall, even if it meant sacrificing everything. Because humanity's fight for survival was just beginning. And no matter what came next, she would lead them forward. Set course for the next system, Seraphina ordered. We're not done yet. With a final look at the stars ahead, Seraphina turned her gaze to the map of the galaxy. The universe was vast, filled with untold dangers and unknown enemies. But it was also full of possibility. And as long as she had breath in her lungs, she would ensure that humanity's light would continue to burn brightly. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: the fight for humanity's future was far from over. And Seraphina Aldrich would lead them into it, no matter the cost.